You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
It's back to school season, and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 224, The Battle About Britain Part 8, The Home Guard and the Airborne Panic. This week, a big thank you goes out to Hank for supporting the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast's episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. Last episode looked at some of the planning and preparations being done in Britain to prepare for a possible German invasion. One of the major concerns shared by British leaders was the fear of a German airborne invasion. This would include an emphasis that was placed on the Home Guard during early May and June, that much ridiculed body of civilian volunteers who would organize all over Britain during the summer months, with the goal of, well, that would depend on who you asked. While the Home Guard was being organized, for the British Army the focus was still on preparing military units to face an invasion, and a critical part of those preparations were the mobile units that would be called upon to meet any German landings, to contain them and then destroy them. All of these preparations meant that between May and September, the overall British ability to meet an invasion drastically increased, and that timing could not have been better. On June 25th, Home Forces Operations Instruction 3 would be published, and it contained some information about why the British defensive preparations had been structured the way that they were. Quote, "The general plan of defense is a combination of mobile columns and static defense by means of strong points and stops. As static defense only provides limited protection of the most vulnerable areas, it must be supplemented by the action of mobile columns. However mobile such columns may be, they cannot be expected to operate immediately over the whole area in which it is possible for the enemy to attempt an invasion by sea or air." End quote. The ending bit there is quite important, the or air, because it had important ramifications for the entire structure of British defenses. During the invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands, German airborne forces had featured prominently, and the British were quite concerned that similar operations would be launched in conjunction with a seaborne invasion. And really, even before the German operations against Western Europe, the commander of the Home Forces, General Kirk, had been planning British defenses under the belief that the very first thing that the Germans would do was drop airborne troops on a port where they could then land further reinforcements. These fears had been reinforced by the actions of May 1940, particularly the Airborne attacks against Fort Ibn Amal in Belgium. But landings near the coast were only one part of the problem, and concerns were also raised about the possibility of the Germans landing forces far back from the coast, deep in the English countryside. This had the effect of spreading out the British defenses far more than they otherwise would have been. The results of these fears were the detailing of units from the coastal defense divisions to guard locations like airfields, just to reduce the risk of losing those areas to a German air attack. Time and effort would also be spent on fixed fortifications, like obstructing rivers and lakes to prevent seaplanes from landing, and then laying obstructions in open fields in southern England to make them unsuitable for glider landings. Fears of airborne operations had an impact far beyond just troops positioning, and man-hours as well, and would have wider ramifications throughout British society. The most important reason for this was the belief that not only would the Germans drop airborne troops, but also parties of saboteurs dressed as civilians. Those groups might then meet up with people in Britain who supported the German cause, with the result being chaos. The Germans even stoked these fears directly by having radio broadcasts that seemed to be sending messages to those fifth columnists throughout Britain in preparation for the invasion. In mid-August, they would even drop empty parachutes in parts of the Midlands, just to make it seem like those kinds of operations were already happening. One of the challenges faced by the British military was the fact that it would be very challenging to prevent the airborne operations from happening. If the Germans dropped airborne troops, it was likely that they would be at least somewhat close to the coast, and this presented a time and distance problem for the RAF. The Ju-52 transports that the German units would use would probably only arrive in small groups, and their goal would not be to penetrate British airspace to reach a distant target like the bombers, but instead to get to their drop zones as quickly as possible and then leave. Not only would they only be over the British coast for a few minutes before they dropped and ran away, they would also be coming in quite low, under 1,000 feet or 300 meters. This meant that formations would be discovered too late for interception, just due to the curvature of the Earth and how radar works. These issues just made it clear that if the Germans wanted to launch an airborne operation, there was little that the RAF could do to prevent it from happening. The reality of German airborne preparations was quite different. Due to the attrition suffered during the operations over Norway and then in the West, the scope of effort for the German airborne forces over Britain was always quite limited. There were some plans to drop some units first behind Dover, but those plans were changed due to obstructions that the British had placed in the landing areas, and instead the drops were moved to the northwest of Folkestone later in the planning. But this was really the only direct plans that have survived, and they were quite small, with the commander of the German airborne forces, General Student, claiming that if he had more troops, he would have advocated for attacks on airfields, but the forces simply did not exist for those bolder operations. They would have been cut off and probably destroyed by the British defenders before other forces could reach them. Fears of a German airborne operation would be one of the stated reasons behind the creation of what would come to be called the Local Defense Volunteers, later to be renamed the Home Guard. On May 14th, Anthony Eden, the Secretary for State of War, would announce the creation of the Local Defense Volunteers with an appeal for volunteers to fill out its ranks. In this appeal, Eden outlined the risks of a major German airborne drop, saying that it would rely on speed to capture key points throughout Britain, and that the best way to defend against such attacks would be for a widespread and local militia to be ready to act at a moment's notice. The appeal would continue, quote, "However, in order to leave nothing to chance and to supplement from sources as yet untapped the means of defense already arranged, we are going to ask you to help us in a manner which I know will be welcome to thousands of you. Since the war began, the government have received countless inquiries from all over the kingdom, from men of all ages, who are, for one reason or another, not at present engaged in military service, and who wish to do something for the defense of the country. Now is your opportunity. We want large numbers of such men in Great Britain who are British subjects between the ages of 17 and 65 to come forward now and offer their service in order to make assurance doubly sure. The name of the new force, which is now to be raised, will be called the Local Defense Volunteers. This name, Local Defense Volunteers, describes its duties in 3 words. It must be understood that this is, so to speak, a spare time job, so there will be no need for any volunteer to abandon his present occupation." End quote. While the reasons that Eden would give in his speech would largely be military in nature, there were also other important reasons for the creation of the volunteers, and one of those was civilian morale. The hope was that by giving individuals who were so inclined to contribute what felt like a meaningful thing to do to help the war effort, they would be happier. And this appeared to be somewhat successful in the beginning, although there would be others who believed that having to rely on a new, unorganized civilian militia just showcased the military weakness of the nation. But, regardless of those naysayers, as soon as the appeal went out, regardless of any possible criticism, there was major support for the volunteers, and it would take just 24 hours for 250,000 people to volunteer for the force. 2 weeks later, that number would be 300,000, and by the end of June, 1.5 million. They would form ad hoc units all over Britain, from the largest cities to the smallest villages. There would even be units formed out of specific factories or organizations. One example would be the post office. During the 1940s, the British post offices delivered mail, but just as importantly, they ran local telephone exchanges, exactly the kind of thing that the Germans would want to capture or destroy during an invasion. The workers at the post offices would also generally volunteer in large numbers, and so it was decided that there would be special post office units of the volunteers created. They were largely staffed by post office workers and were given the explicit task of protecting the post office buildings. These post office units are just one example of many specialized units of the volunteers that were created during this time. As soon as the call went out, as soon as men began volunteering, it did not take long for things to start off, with some of the first patrols occurring just 3 days after the initial call went out from Eden. While the War Office had initially supported the creation of the volunteers, and they did feel that they were useful, they were also expecting maybe a few 100,000 men to volunteer, maybe. When that number was surpassed in just a few weeks and continued to rise even faster, this became a problem. Within the LDV, there was no formal rank structure, which was demanded by the War Office due to the fact that they refused to place any military assets under the command of untrained civilians. There was also no real plan on how to organize units, how to train them, and ensure that they were doing what they were supposed to do. This meant that local LDV units were almost universally led by just local leaders, businessmen, landowners, others who naturally occupied a position of leadership within the community. They would organize the men, do a bit of marching and patrolling, but they often did not do any shooting. Rifles were a serious problem in Britain in the summer of 1940 because everybody wanted them and there were not enough of them to go around. Military rifle production had been spun down after the end of the First World War, with the British Army mostly pulling from First World War stockpiles during the interwar years. And then suddenly, there were large numbers of volunteers who thought they were going to need a rifle, but there were only so many actual military rifles to go around, and there were military units of the British Army that also did not have rifles, particularly those who had been reconstituted from evacuees from the continent or new formations that were set up in the spring and summer of 1940, and they took priority over the local volunteer units. And this was not a small problem, because along with the local volunteers, about 400,000 men had joined the actual British Army and other armed forces from April to June 1940, and they needed the same equipment that the local volunteers were asking for. The lack of equipment was just one of the many problems that the local volunteers had over the following months, as it rapidly became clear to many local volunteer units that they viewed their service and their expectations for that service very differently from those within the government, and particularly those in the War Office. The War Office just wanted the local volunteers to be passive assistants to their efforts, mostly as a way of gathering information and then doing non-combatant tasks that would always be needed. The local volunteers, by and large, saw themselves as a militia force capable of proactive action. If a German attack started, they wanted to be out there hunting for parachutists, harassing German units, and doing other activities that they felt were a more direct benefit to the defense of the nation. This difference in opinion would cause major issues for the local volunteers during the summer months until its role was clarified in August, when it was announced that it would be explicitly the goal of the local defense volunteers in the case of an invasion to slow and obstruct German forces by any means necessary. The good news was, by the time that became their goal, they also had the equipment to maybe make some of that happen, because the equipment situation had completely shifted between June and August, mostly thanks to the arrival of hundreds of thousands of American M1917 Enfield rifles, along with large numbers of other rifles from other nations. And the LVD units were far better equipped to do the thing that they wanted to do once they got those rifles. The local defense volunteers and the home guard that they would eventually become would end up being something of a punchline in later decades, thanks mostly to the popularity of Dad's Army, a British comedic sitcom which released its first episodes in 1968. But in the panic days of mid-May 1940, it was seen as a real solution to the real problem of not having enough men to fight off the German invasion. The challenges only really started when that acute need changed during the summer months, and then the British government and military suddenly had this massive force of vocal and very passionate volunteers that did not really fit in with their new military plans. This was because the entire evolution of the British Army during the interwar years had been to move away from the large conscript armies of the First World War, and instead to more technologically advanced and equipped forces. That was the exact opposite of what the local defense volunteers were, And as soon as the British Army found an opportunity to move away from that sort of levy en masse idea, it would do so. And fortunately for the British military leaders, the availability of just the types of weapons and equipment and vehicles that they wanted to bring back into British military planning, well, the number of those things would begin to expand during the same summer months of 1940, during which the local defense volunteers were exploding in popularity.
Hey business owners, we know you know the importance of maximizing every dollar. With the Delta SkyMiles Reserve Business American Express card, you can make your expenses work just as hard as you. From afternoon coffee runs to stocking office supplies and even team dinners, you can earn miles on all your business expenses. Plus, you can earn 110,000 bonus miles for a limited time through July 16th. The Delta SkyMiles Reserve Business Card. If you travel, you know. Minimum spending requirements and terms apply. Offer ends 7/16/25.
The summer is heating up with Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four.
Light 'em up, Johnny!
On July 25th.
Time to save the planet.
What's the plan?
Trust me, I hate that
It's a
plan.
bad plan. Come on.
Terrible
That's a
idea.
stupid plan.
Prepare for fantastic.
We will face this together as a family.
Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four. First steps. Only in theaters July 25th. Rated PG-13. Some material may be inappropriate for children under 13. Get tickets now.
The mobile columns that the British were able to put together would contain almost all of the armored forces available to the British Army in the British Isles during the summer of 1940, and the exact composition of those forces varied greatly over the months, nearly tripling in number from around 250 in July to 750 by September. The good news was that all of the tanks that had been produced during those months were the latest and most capable British types, which meant that in some ways they were qualitatively superior to the forces that had been sent to France months before. The highest expectations were placed on the 1st and 21st Army Tank Brigades, which were provided with almost all of the Matilda infantry tanks, which were thought to be the strongest counter to German units and equipment. Whether or not these would have been as effective as expected is up in the air, because the home forces suffered from the same doctrinal issues that would cause so much difficulty for the British in the deserts of North Africa in the early years of the war. The problem was that British armored doctrine did not include a combined arms structure, and the infantry and armor were not trained or structured to provide close support to one another. Instead, the tanks were supposed to charge ahead in large numbers and push back the enemy before the infantry following distantly behind arrived to consolidate the objective. These tactics simply did not work against the German armored units, who worked closely with German infantry in a way that made any kind of tank-only or armor-only attack risky at best. The French and the British had discovered this during the fighting in France, but they had not had time to react. These shortcomings in British tactics would take some time to work themselves out, and several defeats in the desert. While there should have been criticism of British armored doctrine, Ironside was also getting some criticism from other British leaders, key among them Churchill himself. On June 28th, Churchill's primary concern was that Ironside was trying to defend the entire coastline, which was always going to be challenging with the available forces. And this was not bad advice. It wasn't a bad criticism. It was impossible to defend the beaches everywhere, but Churchill and others that voiced similar concerns were not taking into account how difficult it was going to be to quickly move large forces around Britain in time to meet an invasion. The standard British Infantry Division of 1940 was supposed to be equipped with 2,000 motor vehicles in a variety of types. These would provide the mobility that was needed to move around the battlefield, both at a tactical level as well as an operational level. But there were not even close to enough vehicles to go around, and while there had been attempts to bolster the transport capabilities of the infantry divisions through civilian cars and trucks, those vehicles were not designed for military transport, and few of them had any off-road capabilities. This meant that while forces might be able to take advantage of the British rail system to get around, once they were off the trains, they were limited to moving at the speed of a walk, and those trains were very vulnerable to Luftwaffe attacks. Because Ironside lacked the ability to race his forces around the countryside quickly, the only option was to spread them out to meet any possible invasion. Even if the thin crust of beach defenders only bought a day, that would be massive when it came to repositioning both the mobile columns and other infantry forces to meet the threat. Ironside knew that the beach defenses were too weak, that they would eventually be overwhelmed, that the Germans held all of the advantages when it came to concentrating their forces. And so he made the best plan that he could think of, with the resources available to him. Now the good news was that every single day that the Germans delayed action, those positions, those defenses, and the troops manning them were getting stronger. This made it more and more likely that the defending units would meet their goals to delay and disorganize with every day that passed on the calendar. These improvements that were happening throughout the summer reduced some of the problems that the British defenders were facing, particularly with the introduction of new equipment due to the efforts of British arms factories. Ironside would not survive in his post to see the greatest fruits of this production, though, because in mid-July, Ironside would be promoted out of the position, given the new rank of Field Marshal, and essentially retired. He would be replaced by General Alan Brooke, who had previously commanded a corps of troops in the field force that had been sent to France. Brooke had been able to take advantage of his relationship with Churchill to transition into the position from his much less important position as the commander of Southern Force. Now, Brooke came into his new position as the commander of Home Forces at a good time, because he was going to have the tools that even he would admit Ironside had not been able to plan on utilizing in the defense because they had not existed when the plans were made. By September, Brooke would have hundreds of additional tanks, but almost more importantly, the equipment and readiness of all of his units had been on the rise. Some of this new equipment had come from the United States, with large purchases of military hardware already on the books for both the British and French before May 1940, and then the British taking over most of the French orders after their exit from the war. The Americans would continue to be an important part of Churchill's hopes during this period, even if he always wished that they were more directly involved. But the isolationists still held sway in Washington, and so there were limits to what could be expected in terms of official actions from the American government. But there would be one thing that the Americans were always interested in, and that was money. And at least during 1940, the British still had the money to spend, and there were always American manufacturers ready to take that money and give war material in return. This included a large series of orders that were placed by the British Purchasing Commission with American firms in May 1940 on all manner of military goods, from personal equipment to tanks and aircraft. British gold reserves were finite, though, and it would soon become clear that unless America entered the war or some kind of arrangement was arrived at, the British would not be able to maintain access to American industry. Eventually, this would result in the Lend-Lease program of 1941, but even before that agreement, Roosevelt and the American government were gearing up their economy to massively increase production. This would include very large armament expansion bills that were put through Congress during the summer of 1940. Later in the year, Roosevelt would give his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech. Quote, "They, Britain, ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and for our security. Emphatically, we must get these weapons to them in sufficient volume and quickly enough so that we and our children will be saved the agony and suffering of war which others have had to endure." But at least at the time that he gave that speech, the British were still only given items that they could pay for. That's getting a bit ahead of our story, though. And during the summer of 1940, a lot of that manufacturing was not yet available. It was still spinning up, gearing up, getting ready to send things across the Atlantic. And the British were just happy with any material that they could get from the United States, because they knew that anything else they would have to produce locally if they were going to fight off this invasion. The good news is that, as I mentioned earlier, the situation was improving every day, with hundreds of thousands of new military recruits going through training, the re-equipping of troops that had been evacuated from France moving ahead at a very good rate, and the continued increase in production levels from British factories. All of this served to improve the overall outlook of the British military throughout the summer. And throughout all of this, even though we've spent 2 episodes discussing invasion preparations, we've not even really talked about the greatest tool that the British had to prevent an invasion: the Royal Navy. We will address the senior service and its plans to meet a German invasion fleet next episode.